How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so Dylan Thomas was a Welsh poet born in 1914. Today I want to talk a bit about a line from one of his best-known works, a poem called Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, a poem he wrote in 1947. So Dylan's poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, is one of the most impassioned cries in modern poetry in the sense of being a refusal to accept the quiet surrender of death. And we see this especially in its most famous line, which serves as a refrain throughout. It goes, "Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Again, here Thomas seems to be clearly urging us to meet death not with resignation and silence, but with something like fury and rebellion. Now, it's said that this poem may have been written as a personal plea to his dying father, but even if it was, it still obviously touches something deeply universal, namely the human impulse to resist being wiped out of existence and to keep on living meaningfully even in the face of inevitable decline. Now, this theme, resistance in the face of mortality, has, of course, deep philosophical echoes. Many writers and thinkers across time have wrestled with how we should live when death is certain and when meaning seems hopeless. While their answers, of course, vary, they all in some way echo Thomas's central demand, which is, do not go quietly. Live deliberately. Fight for meaning and refuse to fade unnoticed. So the first example that comes immediately to my mind is the French philosopher Albert Camus. He clearly would have recognized Thomas's emotional force. I mean, think about his myth of Sisyphus. In the myth of Sisyphus, he imagines the condemned Greek hero Sisyphus eternally pushing a boulder up a hill only to have it roll down again, where there is no respite from this. He has to do this futile task forever. And yet, what does Camus conclude? He concludes that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Now, why? Well, because that's what you do in the face of the absurd and the pointless. Like Sisyphus does, you get back up and you continue. You persist. You choose defiance. So, just like Thomas's dying men, Sisyphus rebels with action. Actually, there's another less well-known work of his that makes a similar point. It happens in a book Camus wrote that he gave up on, only to be published posthumously. It's called A Happy Death. So at the end of that book, the main character, Patrice, dies quietly and alone, but with a very deliberate effort to keep his eyes open the whole time and to remain lucid. This is what Camus writes as he describes the dying man. He writes, "Fever helped him here, and with it an exultant certainty of sustaining consciousness to the end, of dying with his eyes wide open." Anyway, the point is that for Camus, you do your best to stave off death. Or if you die not in fear, but with a final act of consciousness and clarity, embracing the absurdity of it all. Okay, so who else shares in this sort of spirit? Well, how about the German philosopher Nietzsche? Someone Camus was deeply influenced by the way. I mean, Nietzsche believed that strength lies in affirming life, not denying it. For him, true vitality not only comes from overcoming and from creating one's own values in a chaotic world, but it's also expressed by those of us who, like Nietzsche's Overman, are able to look mortality right in the face and say yes to life anyway. So, like Thomas, Nietzsche rejects passivity and resignation. Like Thomas, he refuses to bow down before the great abyss. Actually, now that I think about it, speaking of Nietzsche, another thinker here that was influenced by him was the the psychologist Viktor Frankl. So famously, of course, he was a concentration camp survivor, and he later wrote about the horror and the death trap those Nazi camps were. Now, facing what seemed like imminent death, how did he survive? Well, he found resistance not in rebellion or in power, but in meaning. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, argues that human beings can endure almost any suffering as long as they have a reason or a why to live for. As he himself says, those who have a why to live can bear almost anyhow. In other words, for Frankl, survival depended not just on luck or strength, but on the ability to hold onto a purpose, which could mean a lover or a future task or a belief. So while Thomas calls for rage, Frankl calls for purpose. But both of them, however, call for an active stance towards life in the face of seeming death. Okay, well, so how about the great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy? I mean, he too, in his own way, might be said to be dramatizing Thomas's rage, but in a more psychological form. And he does this especially so in his novel called The Death of Ivan Illich. So there what happens is that the protagonist, a successful but shallow man who's terminally ill, realizes too late that his life lacked authenticity. So his fear here isn't really a fear of death, but it's a fear of dying without having truly lived. In other words, for him, the horror of a meaningless life becomes more unbearable than death itself. Thomas's poem can be read then as a warning against this kind of fate, against drifting through existence only to wake up at the end completely empty and regretful. So rage in this context is not just about resisting death, it's about refusing to live a false and inauthentic life. And I suppose I can't end without saying something about the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. I mean, in his magnum opus, Being and Time, he argues that only by fully confronting our mortality can we live authentically. But that doesn't happen, Heidegger says, because most people, in one way or another, distract themselves from death. And they do this mostly by living as what he calls a they, which is a diluted, anonymous version of life shaped by social expectations and norms. But to live authentically means to live as he calls it, as a being toward death. That's to say, as someone who carries the reality of one's own death consciously, using it to enhance life's urgency and to truly become oneself. So to get back to Thomas, what Heidegger offers is not rage as a kind of emotional resistance, but rage or resistance as a kind of existential awakening. So ultimately then, what unites all of these thinkers is not a denial of death, but a refusal to let it dominate the meaning of life. Their basic message is pretty much the same. Don't drift toward death in complacency. No, live deliberately and die awake and be a vision of light flickering against the darkness. You know, in a world that often wheedles us into numbness, whether that's through routine or distraction or quiet anguish, Thomas reminds us that resistance matters, that how we face the end reflects how we've lived up until then, and that as darkness comes, the human spirit still has one thing left to do: refuse to surrender the flame and rage. Bye for now.